It's nice to be here, guys. Nice to meet you all. Yeah, I hope we have a great panel, great chat. I don't actually, not done too many panels. I did one at PAX. This is like my second or third panel, so I'm not really panel experienced. So I know some of you are probably way more experienced than I am. But really fun to meet you all and discuss what's on the list. Stoked for that when we get to it. And I work at Fallen Leaf, developing Fort Solace, which is our announced game, coming out later this year. I don't know how much more of an introduction we really want to do. So I'll pass it on.
Hey, I'm Zolliver Nelson Jr., studio head over at Strange Scaffold. I've worked on a lot of things, over 70 games over the past 7 years, with a bunch of different people, stuff like Hypnospace Outlaw, stuff like Stranger Things VR, Reigns Beyond, Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator, and an airport for aliens currently run by dogs in my own studio, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is also primarily in the single player realm. So I'm really excited for today's topic about building atmosphere in a single player experience. The game that's directly applicable to that our studio is working on now and is announced and that you can wishlist on Steam is El Paso Elsewhere, a Max Payne spiritual successor where a black monster hunter goes through a haunted motel to kill the monster he loved before she destroys the world. And I'll pass it on to Benny.
Cool. Yep, I'm Benny. I'm the creative director at Bonsai Collective. We're working on a game at the moment called Lunar Abyss, which was announced in August last year, which can also be found on Steam if you want to wishlist it. I've worked on quite a few games over the past maybe 13, 14 years. I started my career with Pete, actually, who'll be introducing himself next at Wallpaper Games. We developed a game called Ether 1 together. And then after that, I worked on lots of independent games. I worked on Duskers as a writer and narrative designer. I worked on a game called Hue with Henry Hoffman. I worked on Lost Words Beyond the Page. I was the creative director and writer on Cube 2, as well as some other kind of contract works with larger studios. And yeah, me and my business partners, we founded Bonsai Collective in 2019. Have been developing Lunar Abyss ever since. So.
Yeah, and so I'm Pete Bottomley, studio head over at Whitepaper Games. As Benny said, we co-founded Whitepaper Games back in 2012. We've primarily worked on single-player, very narrative-driven games, and more branching into a little bit more cinematic storytelling in our later titles. So Ether 1 was a first-person, I guess, walking simmy style of game. And then our second game, The Occupation, which came out around 2017, was more immersive simmy in nature. So we wanted to take the kind of systemic and emergent elements of these kind of titles like Thief, Dishonored, Deus Ex, and try to apply some of those walking simmy approaches in narrative delivery. And then our third title, Conway Disappearance at Daily View, was our kind of first foray into non-first person titles. It was a fixed camera title. We put a focus on cinematic storytelling, both through gameplay cameras and scripted camera sequences. And that came out the back end of last year. And yeah, we just continue to work on very single player, but narrative driven experiences.
This was kind of hanging around for Vincent to come in then, but maybe he's lurking. But that's the problem of going first, isn't it? My intro sucked. So you guys did way better. Well done. Should we get to the first question? Should we just move to that, yeah?
Let's go for it.
Okay, so the question on the sheet I have is, how important is world building in a single player game? And how does it impact the player's experience? So I guess if you guys want to hit on a few beats here, or do you just want to go around and perhaps give your own spin? How do you guys
I think when I was thinking about this question, for me at least, and I think Benny was a similar vein in this, there's the kind of tension between push and pull narrative. And by push and pull narrative, the push is the game just needs you to know something. It needs some kind of information on the critical path. The story needs to make sense of what you're trying to communicate. So there's a certain amount of push narrative you inevitably need to do in a game. But we try to only make that maybe 20 to 30% of the overall experience. The pull narrative, the threads that the player is pulling at, are way more interesting to us as creators, because that's essentially the interactive element of the medium that you're in. So when environmental storytelling comes in, and how you build these worlds and dress these scenes is super important from our perspective. Again, just the classic examples of things like BioShock and Half-Life, just creating a world and making it a believable place that the player wants to explore. Just so much heavy lifting for your narrative delivery and storytelling. So for us, it's super important. And yeah, the way I see that is the kind of push and pull. Benny, I don't know if I don't know whether we specifically spoke about those terminologies in conversation, but is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, I'd definitely say so. You know, that kind of that push is very much usually kind of this kind of critical pathway that you need the players to kind of move down in some capacity, and that could be the most gamified aspect of kind of world building, I think, and kind of narrative within kind of a space. But that pull, those kind of those real draws for players to really, you know, kind of sink their teeth into. I find that world building in a single player game anyway, world building itself isn't necessarily something that's just being consumed. It's something that is utilized in development as a stimulus for everything in the kind of the game world. So, for example, how important is it to a single player game? Well, everything that we build in a story game anyway is drawn from world building to a certain extent, and if we are driving all aspects of our games, whether it's mechanics, whether it's the environment art, whether it's the sound design, whether it's the composition, music composition, for example, is drawing from a pool of world building, an engine, so to speak, of world building that's feeding everything else, then it's really that kernel of what makes kind of narrative games interesting, regardless of whether it's an action narrative game or whether it's a walking simulator or anything. So that's where all those pull threads come from, in my opinion, Pete, I would say. So they come from that engine, so to speak. So
that's that awkward moment, isn't it? Mr. Nelson, you going to come in, or because there's stuff to unpack there, I think, but also, Mr. Nelson, do you have anything to add to it?
I'll reinforce the points made by the other panelists to start. Just really talking about how world building is the origin point behind the scenes. If it is rich, and then if it is targeted and delivered to specifically augment and amplify the player's experience, the better it feels. You can have actually pretty awful world building, but if it surfaces in interesting ways, it won't particularly matter. On the other hand, as will sometimes happen in indie games in particular, you've written so much cool world building, you want to put it everywhere and use it everywhere, and it doesn't actually make the player's experience better. So they're just looking at you confused, a little bit frustrated. They want to get past it, and you're like, no, but we paid for this. We have to use all the stuff we paid for. World building is extremely important as origin, and as I'm sure we're going to address later in this panel, how it gets surfaced is perhaps even more so, which is why at this point for my games, and for games that I'm brought in to work on, I go for targeted world building. What will the player see? Making world building that specifically will impact their experience and as little as necessary to bind all of that around it.
Well, that's probably a really good segue, actually. I was going to say, sorry to cut you off there, Pete, but to what techniques we use to create these worlds, right? Both as indie and other studios. I don't know if that's to your point, Pete, that's coming now, but maybe moving on to the second question, kind of ropes in now. It's a nice segue to talk about those techniques, because it's interesting you mentioned about paying for stuff. Because I certainly feel that, you know, you order something, you paid for it, you developed, you think, I don't really want to throw this away. But also you have to understand when the feedback comes back, the ghost reviews, the playtest, etc. Sometimes it needs to go. And that is a hard decision for somebody, I think, that's maybe not done it before, but is maybe it's their first time going through it. You know, you don't. How do you know what to cut, what to keep? And I think that's probably where the techniques come in, trying to avoid those crumple zones, as I like to call them. But anyway, sorry, Pete, you were saying.
Yeah, no, I mean, to that point specifically, James, it's that I can't recall a time where we've ever cut content based on playtest feedback. Of course, play direction, there might be just confusion in the delivery. Maybe something looks super appealing, and this desk over here is looks really juicy and it was created by the artist, but there's actually no set dressing or world building there. But what we actually do there, and I guess this is to the point that the previous point that I was going to make, is we kind of lean into that stuff. And if an artist has made this area look great, then we use a kind of I believe we stole this from Naughty Dog. I can't be completely sure, but Naughty Dog, when they're creating jumps, for example, if you can jump 1 meter as whatever Naughty Dog character, there will be no gaps between double that distance. So between 1 and 2 meters, they won't create any gaps, because the player might try to make it but just fail. So they'll always elongate the gaps, for example. So how that applies to environmental storytelling and world building is that if there's any small props placed, and we like to pick up, we like very tactile interactions in our games. You pick up all the different items on the desk. If those items are small enough and the player thinks they look interesting, we double down on that, and we actually pick things up and add a little dialogue line or some storytelling or some world building to that. And I think that was what I was going to say about the previous point, is I can't think of too many instances where we specifically script or write world building elements before we see it in the game. Again, we'll go back to this critical path kind of push narrative. We'll have the core beats down and we'll know what we want to communicate. But it's very rare that we'd say, and then the player goes over to this desk and sees this thing. We generally start building the world and react to what the artists, designers, and other disciplines are doing, and then try to build the narrative around that, because it just feels like a way more cohesive world. If we know where the player's going and what they're thinking and what they want to do, we kind of try to just say yes to them and build in the narrative there, because that was something that they were trying to pull at to begin with, and you kind of just want to reward that. So yeah, it's just interesting how you both were communicating that there.
I think there's an aspect, is co-creation with your team, right? Okay, so when we talk about building world building early on, it is building the stimulus for which other developers in our team can grow their own ideas and kind of connect back with the vision of the game. It always starts with a very clear vision of what we want to achieve, right? Okay, so that isn't the detail, that's not the minutia, that's the high level kind of aspect of it. And so I think what you're kind of saying there, kind of, Pete, is there's a dialogue to be had with every aspect of development in world building as well. So you know, in kind of what we use in kind of techniques is obviously we write script. You know, the script is kind of really the story of the game. We write lore, you know, and all of these things serve as again, come back to your point as well, Zalavia, is kind of points of origin for everyone in our team to kind of draw from and then add to and then build. And we find some of the best world building is when, say, an artist does take something that they've just seen, that small detail, and they grow something really big out of it, and then that's something that players can really engage with, that's not shoved down their throat as well. It's maybe something that we pass through as an bit of environmental storytelling, and we have quite a lot of that in Lunar Abyss, stuff that we don't explain, because there's a dialogue also, in a similar essence, there's a dialogue to be had with the players as well. You don't want to throw all that stuff down their throats. So as they're playing through the game, if you've built that into your techniques in the studio about how ideas are kind of generated and how they're applied into the game, that naturally pays dividends, I think, as the player plays through the game, because they're engaging with that whole part of that process as well. So,
and I love, Benny, what you say about how that extends to the team. It's almost like you're pitching the team on the game that you want them to make, so that they can, from that same shared vision, yeah, as you said, unprompted, deliver pieces of that vision to players, come up with things that are conveying that world building without ever needing to be told necessarily. So one of my favorite examples of that on a project I worked on was there was a depressed farmer who had lost his family. And when the artist was doing a walkthrough of the game, this is the first part where I had started to pick up, hey, not just the fact that we can tell people stuff and share the resources of world building with them, but specifically try to pitch them on the game and the vision we were trying to sell to players. When the artist was doing the walkthrough of the living room, they showed us a picture on the mantelpiece and how it was turned away from the player. And they were like, yeah, that was because it has a picture of the farmer and his family on it. I figured that it might be an interesting story detail to have that turned away because the farmer wouldn't stuff it somewhere necessarily, but they would be pained seeing it every time they walked into the room, so they might turn it a little bit so it's at an oblique angle. And I loved that, and I was like, okay, we got to do that for every game we make from now on.
Cool. I guess we'll go back to me. I'll wait for someone to interject then. But yeah, it's interesting really with the scenes because I think now, having done it in AAA before, I've had scenes that were too long. I don't know if you guys have had that, but something has been written, mocapped. We've got it in. Reviews come back. The player's in that scene for 3 or 4 minutes without input, without being active, etc. We've lost like a minute of that scene at the end, before it went to market. So I've had it before. We've had too much, but people really insisted on that being relevant, and because there's always not a dissidence, but like the design team, narrative team, right? The narrative guys really wanted it for the world building. It's important to them. Then you've got the gameplay experience. If the feedback on this side is conflicting with this, I think that's where you forget a really interesting duality. Where do you cut things? How do you find a good compromise? Because moving over to indie, I find the stuff I try to do a lot more focused. If that makes sense. And like used to any involving team members, it's more of a collaborative, right? Because you don't have 10 designers to go off and write this one scene, so you'll do the beats, the core bones of it, and then it'll be added to by the team as we go, right? The art team will come in and go, actually, we thought this was cool, so we put this here based off what was written down here, and it will naturally become more of a collaborative process between team than perhaps just what I was used to in the past. So I found that quite interesting as well. Don't want to hang too much on that because I thought next one is how we can show examples, right? Of how we've done this in games that we've worked on ourselves. So I thought that would be quite a cool. Who wants to start? I know I just gave one then, but anyone else want to jump in? I can talk for hours.
I can take it this time. So trying to use world building effectively. I think my favorite thing is kind of surfacing wild ideas. So, but in a very throwaway way that makes the player go like, wait, what are you talking about? The moon is gone. And the game is like, no, don't worry about it. In curiosity is one of the greatest drivers that good world building can create so that they actually want to see more world building. So, in Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator, one of the randomized events that comes up talks about how humans were again voted the 7th most delicious endangered meat, and how prices for their organs explode. And alongside having a systemic effect in the world of course, the human originating organs that you've been buying and trading going up in price, which may or may not be to your detriment, suddenly players are asking questions about the role of humans in this world, how exactly that functions. And, I can drop a name like Warlord Hargan and how he has declared a truce and how the market doesn't like that because then that means less need for organs because of the armed conflict. Space Warlord Organ Trading Simulator in particular just has a bunch of little details like that builds a very large world from very small pieces that get the player asking questions about like, hey, who's bringing in these organs actually? And then you answer that, but only a little bit.
I mean, it is interesting. I think the more I dig into India and the stories that are told, if that makes sense, they're a bit more wider in scope, a bit more off the charts, right? But that actually brings me to the next thing is I looked at your game, Benny, in the Abyss. Yeah, there's some scary things down there. But the question I had for you was, I mean, how does that translate with what you're doing, Benny? How much you can talk about, of course, but because that's really interesting that you use, how to say it, like there's a lot of action from what I've seen, at least what I've seen anyway. But how do you offset that with examples of story, world building within yours? Because the game's moving so fast, right? And you're asking for the player's attention to be on screen at all times. But presumably you're world building this Abyss as well, right?
Yeah, completely. So context is obviously king in that kind of situation, making sure that whatever the player's doing feels relevant to why they are there and what we're asking them to do with our kind of get play spaces, right? So, for example, in Lunar Abyss, we you're a prisoner, and you've been sent to this alien moon, which we call the Red Moon or the Mimic Moon, which, funnily enough, coming about the moon missing, this is an additional moon that appeared in space 250 years.
Everybody always makes moons prisons.
Moons are
Like,
great,
I've
right?
seen Glenn do it in Callisto. Here you are, like, just send them to the moon. No one else.
Destroy the moon, blow up the moon,
Yeah.
have the moon be missing, have half the
Exactly.
moon
Yeah.
present.
Moons have it rough.
It's a point of wonder, right? So from Earth, it's that intangible thing that's all the way. We know what it is scientifically. No one here has visited the moon. So yeah,
Well,
so
if you give it time, Elon will take you.
well, yeah, hopefully if it doesn't, ships don't explode. So, but yeah, so that's kind of the setup for the game. And so you're sent there, and from the player's perspective, you know why you're sent there from a surface level, that you are sent to this moon because you've got something called the marker Luna, which is red eyes, but you don't really understand what the machinations of the world are for why people with red eyes are sent to this space, right? Okay. And so as you're kind of thrown in the deep end and basically told to work off your sentence, to explore this space and recover technology and a variety of other kind of roles that you as a prisoner will kind of play, the aggression of the space and the enemies that you face, and why they're attacking you, all are derived from world events that have happened prior to you getting there, and they're things for the player to discover. But even if they don't discover it, feels contextually relevant to that point in time, and that's what world building, I think, is. World building shouldn't be used as an exhaustive lore library. I think that's one of the things that I'm kind of firmly quite against. World building is really used to.
So you don't have a grand library where all the history is, and you can read it.
No, not really. So
How dare you, Benny?
we have temples. We have temples of world building, and then we use that to write our lore, right? Okay, so in the lore needs to be loose enough to have those gaps between, point 1 and point 2, and so the player can kind of co-create the world with us, right? So, and that's what makes it personal, it's what makes it meaningful to them. But yeah, so it's the world building drives the context of those combat spaces. So for traditional story points like dialogue or whatever, we have like those classic walking simulator kind of moments where we're walking through a really interesting environment and we're hearing kind of a character speak to us and talk to us about the kind of game world, and then it's punctuated with that action, but that action feels contextually relevant. A great example of this is every time you go into an arena combat, which is similar to like Doom, I guess, we have these sentries that we call Mother Eyes, and you don't know who Mother is, but they scream at you essentially and always shout something narratively, and then they call all the enemies into the kind of space, and it's really it's great for tension building, but also it is a mystery. It's one of those mysteries in the world. Is like why is this thing doing this, or why does this thing exist in this way? So yeah, so.
It sounds like a handshake, good meal, and then they leave you with the bill.
It's a wonderfully relaxing experience. So,
well, it sounds fun. I'm looking forward to it. But I guess that buys into a little bit of what people were saying earlier about curiosity, right? You walk into this environment, and that curiosity there helps tell the story. But do you have anything to add to that, Pete?
Yeah, not necessarily. I think what I was thinking when Benny was talking about that is that sometimes it's the threads that aren't necessarily part of the story that you're trying to tell. And so even adding superfluous information, whether it be some random person getting barred from a pub, or you find a wallet somewhere, or some kind of thing that's happened in the world that is nothing to do with the story, but it reinforces the universe that you're making and the game that you're telling. As long as nothing breaks that narrative, it just feels like, oh, this is a larger space and more things are happening here. So I feel like that reinforces that curiosity aspect when you do put things into the titles that you're working on that aren't just part of this core narrative that you're trying to communicate.
Do you have examples of this? Anything come to mind, or is it more just?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to draw on a specific example. We reinforce this all the times in our titles. We kind of loosely call it a white paper universe, in that Ether 1 can exist in the world of the occupation, and occupation can exist in the world of Dahlia View. And we base our games on fictional British towns across the UK. So different timelines. And it's not that the player would need to have played these previous titles, but we just like to have those, say a key event happen in one title and it kind of alludes to it in another game. And I think for players that have never played our other titles, that's just cool world building, and they don't know that it's connected to this large universe thing. But then for the people that have played those titles, it reinforces, we kind of know that they've got it if they have played our other titles, and it makes it, I don't know, maybe a more cohesive experience. I'm not sure, but yeah, we just like to double down on that stuff where possible.
It's kind of like studio DNA, you know.
Mm.
That's present in all of your games, right? So if you play,
Yeah.
if you reach those titles, you played a couple, you kind of get when you see the logo come up, the studio logo, you think, you know, you feel like you can get some more of that. Right? I think that's important consistencies to have between that translates between projects, right? As creatives within the space, because it helps you build on what you did before, but maybe in new and creative ways, but you're still retaining, you know, the identity you had before, and maybe even a different wrapper or different story, whatever. But it allows you to work, I don't know, more efficiently, better as a dev for the next time. If you stay within your means.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say it also gives players this really interesting thing that I love that you raised this point of just like meta world building, right? Where if every time they come into your game, you've messed with the moon in some fundamental way, they'll start looking for what happened to the moon in that universe, and it will be an organic point for them to pursue or to look for to understand the rest of what the game is communicating. Our kind of absurd thread is we have used the same by accident. We've used the same anatomically correct heart model in all of our games, regardless of how cute they look. So we have this upcoming game where adorable animals who robbed a bank and are now telling you why they did it so they don't get executed by the mafia. You get to decorate their boat while you play cards and talk to them. And players have been asking us, hey, where's the heart? Where's the anatomically correct heart? And it's like, well, do we got to put that in? It's a part of the world building now. People are looking for that heart. So for better or worse, it becomes a really cool thing. And like a lot of my favorite single player storytellers like Remedy do a lot of great stuff with this.
Yeah, and so well, I mean that probably bleeds into our next one really a little bit, and is how we do approach tension building without relying solely on combat and action sequences. Now, whether that's decorating a boat or not, I don't know. But there might be tension there if you haven't got a heart. Maybe that is tension building, and maybe you've deliberately saying you're not getting the heart yet, and that's where the tension is from. But I mean, do you guys have experiences where you've deliberately created and built tension without having to rely on, you know, those sequences?
I think as long as you're mechanically consistent throughout the game, and even though it's not a player-facing formula, the player is kind of understanding how they're approaching this game, what the moment-to-moment gameplay is, and the actions that they're participating in. And for me, I think, and I've only really thought about this as you prompted this question, so it's not something I've deeply thought about, but at some point in each one of our titles, we subvert a gameplay mechanic. So we try to take something that the player's been doing and we just change it up. Still, that the player would understand why it's happening, but it creates that, oh, what's happening here? Oh, okay. And I think that whenever you maybe catch the player off guard like that, even if it's consistent with the world building rules and things like that, I feel like that might be the device that we use more than anything when creating tension in a certain scene where they have to react in a different way that they may not have had to react before, or something along those lines.
And as far as creating tension, I love what you touched on there, Pete, as far as like mechanics, because the idea of mechanical silence, I think, is really powerful, especially for indie titles and for projects by smaller studios, because if you have a consistent ability and then you take it away for a brief amount of time, or stuff like Silent Hill will just have you walk through a very long hallway or a very long stairway, and no combat, no action. The idea of the player, they aren't being robbed of anything. It's in terms of agency, because this can get used in the negative direction, but they are specifically being given a space in which they're wondering when they will next be given an ability, or something that they've relied upon is taken away and forces them to use their other mechanics in an interesting way. Mechanical silence. That's what the Metroidvania is built upon. You start with all your cool stuff, and then it's all taken away. And that first moment of tension, because you feel naked and alone, you're even kind of wondering what abilities you have anymore. That's fascinating.
I think that's really true, and I think it's kind of it's subverting expectation really within the flow of what the player's been experiencing, because as they experience your games or my games, or we build certain rules. Games are just rules, and so we have a natural expectation that grows over time, and then you can start to play with that as a tool, of tension. Really, there's a couple of moments I can't talk about them specifically in Lunar Abyss because they're those kind of pivotal moments. But there's a couple of moments that we have that really play with the idea of what we've taught the player already. So yeah, and we don't necessarily do it hugely mechanically in the same way say Metroid does, but we do have those Silent Hill moments where we don't have any combat for a significant amount of time, and that is all about atmosphere building. It is about tension. It's about building to a piece of information that's going to change how the player sees this kind of space, right? And to make that as impactful as possible, we're using the environment art. We're putting the players in environments that they didn't necessarily expect to be in. Great games that do this, Nier Automata is a really great example. It's a bit of a slight influence on some of the work that we do. You are suddenly in a world that has no texture, right? Okay, and the player's like, what is this kind of space? And that mystery and that it's akin to going into somewhere that's so strange and alien to what we've been told. So yeah, and that naturally starts to kind of create tension with the space. And obviously we're using all the tools at our disposal at that point as well. We're using audio, we're using music, we're using architectural kind of spaces and spatial feeling, putting the players in tight spaces makes them feel one way, putting them in large spaces feels another way, and just using all those kind of different tools to really drive a feeling of tension. And then now again, we then throw them in a boss encounter, right? Okay, so out of the middle of nowhere, and then we're using the traditional combat tension again. So yeah, so
I can just see it. It's like the half an hour of nothing, and then I see a little eye down the tunnel ready to scream at me, and I'm like, I know what's up. Mother's here. But no, we try and do a little bit of this in Solace as well. It's like finding that right balance between the absence of action and the weight of action that comes after, right? Because if you have an absence for a while, then when that moment does happen, it maybe, well, hopefully has more meaning as a result. So it's finding that balance, because too many people not zone out, but they become accustomed. If you have too little, it can get, boring or too slow perhaps for people's engagement. So there's always a great balance there, and I think that can come with world building as well, because it can be done in many different ways. So to your point, Ben, it can be done like that. A game that predominantly does have action all of a sudden doesn't, and that really creates a nice interesting dynamic. Maybe you subvert a mechanic like Pete said, or play with more moons. That's in my mind now. I think I've got Phobos and Deimos. We don't have a prison on either. I might fix that. But I think that's a really important thing to remember, is when you are building these worlds, it's a case of, how much of these beats, these crumbs do you have along the way, and for your payoff, if that makes sense. And that can really be done by how you weigh and balance your mechanic interactions throughout the game, right? So I don't know if you guys do this, but I always put a lot of weight into, okay, well, how much has this been used in this chapter, and how much are we doing here, and how many inputs have we had in the last 5 minutes? Because if the answer is 100, that's insane, right? It makes actions in the game more meaningful with more weight, and I hope that comes across in our game. I've seen other games go the other way. I don't know if you guys have played High Rush from Tango Works. A lot of action in that game, a lot of inputs all the time, right, with the music, but it all gels so well and is so fluid that you don't really notice it because that's I would say, the baseline input, per minute. So it doesn't seem like a step back or step out of reach to do that. And there's still world building during this, right? All these scenes and everything. So that's a really nice contrast, I think. I don't know if that's classed as AAA. Maybe it is. But anyway, so let's talk about challenges. Yeah, because it's not always easy. So let's talk about challenges, for instance, that we face when we do world building. What are the challenges? I probably touched on a couple there, but you guys have good, not necessarily examples from your own titles if you don't have it, but examples from popular titles that we know.
I think it's consistency and interaction. Kind of what I was talking about before with the table example. If you want the player to go and interact with the mug on the desk and find the bit of lipstick on the mug rim or something like this, then player understands that, oh, I can pick up mugs in this game. And if they go over to another table and the mug isn't interactable, they just kind of breaks something in the game rule isn't consistent enough for them or something like that. And even though they probably don't articulate or verbalize it with playtesting or something, there's just something broken there for them. So consistency, I think, is the hardest thing, especially later in production when more and more content's going in, just making sure that, yeah, more than anything, consistency is met throughout the world.
Kind of the Scooby-Doo problem, right? Of you can tell what the characters are going to interact with, or what is going to end up being a secret panel because it's drawn differently from the entire rest of the scene.
But I can't believe you mentioned Scooby-Doo because it's like my favorite show. So like I sit on the plane sometimes with my service and people, when you see people watching Scooby-Doo, they look at us like, what's he watching? Like, I'm like, just old Scooby-Doo from the 70s and the 80s, not the new stuff. But yeah, I fully agree. It is, you don't even know what you're touching, right? But I mean, to that point, have you had challenges with your titles as well, buddy? Have you had stuff where you thought, world building is not exactly on fire here, but I do need a bucket of water?
I think of course we have challenges in different ways, different narrative kind of constructs. We had, I think, more challenges with this project, less in the world building area, but more in character development. Was a little challenging in some aspects, but I think with world building for us, it's about knowing when to stop half the time, because when you're building a world and you're really getting into the detail of that kind of space, it's very easy. I've found it easy to over-explain things, so put too much into the game world and then it kind of just dead flattens evereverything, right? Okay, for the player, and we lose.
Hey, look, we've all done 10-line talk.
Exactly. So paragraphs and books of lore. No, because it's exciting, and so in our team, I work really closely with our senior writer Laura Mauro, and we work really. We kind of build the world kind of together, and then kind of draw upon the different departments, such as the art department, design departments, to kind of help grow that as well. And so we iteratively solve problems as and when they kind of come up, whether that is, well, does this make sense for the kind of world, or does that fit into the tone and themes that we're actually trying to kind of convey within this kind of space? So, because we have some fun stuff in the game world, it's a dark, insidious world, but sometimes we might put something a little jovial in there, and we have to kind of go, does that kind of work? Is that cringy? Does that kind of still fit within the thematic pillars of the kind of game world, even though it's a joke? Great. Again, I'm coming back to characters, because I think we have a lot of characters in our game that you speak to, and one of those characters is brilliant. A character called Ellie that the players will meet quite early on in the game, and they are just full of kind of like jokes and one-liners, and they're kind of like making light of the kind of world because they've been here for such a long time that they're kind of almost indifferent to it. And when we first had that character in, when we first put the lines in without the voiceover, I was unsure if it fit, like, world building wise. Like, does it kind of work with this type of game? but we, some people in the team didn't think it did, but a lot of people in the team thought this character was great, and so we kind of really dug into that, and we found out, well, what's the angle of this within the kind of themes and pillars of our world building, and it's one of the best characters you'll meet in the game now, so really fits in the game world, really great, and at that point we kind of figured out where we fit. We're not like, something like Callisto Protocol, for example, that is all horror and kind of, quite serious, and there's a realist aspect to that kind of great kind of game world to kind of explore, where something a little bit weird fiction, kind of liminal and in between, and actually some of those challenges that we faced helped us solve those kind of problems. So
I mean, the challenges for me is always iteration, right? Because I think when predominantly worked on the AAA games, you always have the blueprint up front, right? Everyone's agreed, everyone's on board, 200 people go at it. Then this time, I think I've struggled with having what I would say would be the core of the game, but then as it gets built, because in indie you get to things at certain stages, right? And when something is realized and built, I think one of my difficulties I've had is iterating, not on the fly, but iterating to what's real now. The way the world's built, the way the character's built, which I didn't have before when I had the original idea for the room or the scene or whatever it is. So you're not iterating on the fly, but you're adapting to the team's development schedule and the results of that, right? Because sometimes you get really great surprises. So we have a fantastic art director, Mark Koshte, who works with us, and he'll create an amazing scene that I didn't even think about when you originally had that concept, right? So now you come back to the room and you go, okay, there's an opportunity to do more world building here, like way better than what I had, right? But now, do you adapt to that, or do you just leave it and stick to your core experience because you don't want to bloat as well? Because there is elements of that, right? And you can get carried away, as we all do as game developers. But I find it comes down to the player's journey. Where do you want them to go? How would you want them to feel in certain moments? Because if, for instance, we make like this weird plant, if I want to make a joke about it, that might set what just happened 2 minutes before and feel really, really odd with the tone of what's happening right now. And I'm not really thinking about that because I got excited about the plant. So I found that as a struggle. Certainly this time around, I'm making it all feel like a consistent experience from start to finish. All my blocks are in order, and I'm constantly going back and just looking and going, is this relevant? Is this challenging? Have I adapted? And I think that is unique to indie development. I don't know if you guys can speak to experiences on other projects before the ones you're currently on, but this is not the first time I've encountered it. The first time I've worked in a more modular way, I think, than a more globally big team way. That's been really challenging for me mentally to adapt to that process, instead of coming at it from no, this is the way, I've just finished the Mandalorian, so I've said that about 5 times today. So but this is what we're doing. This is it. I've actually come back now and gone, you know what, now that we have this, let's just sit down and have a little revisit about what we can do here, because this is an exciting opportunity. And I think that's one of the small things with working with a small team. And you can have that kind of collaboration, right? And I think that's really important. But really, I guess what I'm getting at is I'm pushing it towards what we would say is player agency in our game, right? What point does that play a role in the world building process? Because as much as I want to create a fun house, just the player agency and what we call the player path, at what point does it become a conflict? Am I just detracting from that experience now, and as a result detracting from the core experience of the game because I'm now interfering, essentially by just putting everything everywhere? Do you guys have examples of that, or even thoughts about it? Are you pro bloat? We're getting towards the summer, or are you, against the bloat? Because I feel like it's pollen season. I'm swelling every day. So there you go. So what do you guys think about that?
I think player path on the challenges question, my is something I think about a lot, because we're dealing with a very voiced right now. And every time you have a voice line needs a certain amount of time to be delivered. So you're not just thinking about when it's delivered, but how long it takes for it to be delivered, how long before the next one, making sure a player doesn't cut themselves off from hearing story or from hearing necessity, or rather lines that they need to hear to continue to progress. It's really, really, really immense. And that idea of here's a really important line for the player, but we've only got roughly 2 seconds. So we got to cut it, or we have to cut it down so much to where it can only maybe hit one of 3 goals it's supposed to hit. Yeah, that's the player path is constantly on my mind, because I've primarily come from the indie side, as opposed to your experience, and the more I deal with the considerations of how much space does the player have to absorb something.
But it's really interesting, because that's something I'm struggling with right now. Is like, at what point do you have the character say, "I need to go to the maintenance unit," but not like that, but like that, right? And you're like
Yeah.
sat there going, "Did they hear it? Did they hear the line?" And then the player's like, "I don't know where I'm going." And you're like, "Okay." Then the objective comes up, go to the maintenance unit. And you're like, "Did they see that?" I'm like, "No, I didn't see that." And you're like, "Okay." So do the character, do you build that in to repeat, what we call, helplines? Or do you keep going with it? Or do you just go, "You know what? We only got time for one line. We don't want to keep bringing it up, but we also don't want the player lost, right? Orientation matters." So it's a case of, how many times do you say it? How many times do you record it? Because I had a great story. We have Roger Clark voice in our game, and there's only so many ways you can read "go to the maintenance unit." And he looked at me after about 10. I was like, "Do you want me to do it a different way?" I was like, "Is there a different way?" I was like, "Is there a more engaging way?" Because I'm really interested with that, right? Because it does interfere with world building, because it pulls you, not fourth wall stuff, right? But it pulls you back to remind you to play a game, and you do have an objective, and you do need to go somewhere in order for the game to progress, right? We've got more stuff planned for you. Please go down the road, get there. We'd like to show you some more cool things we've done, maybe even some clever things, or maybe just an eye that screams at you, right, Benny? So, Pete, Benny, do you guys have anything to add to that? I mean, do you struggle with those?
Yeah,
elements?
so I'm hearing 3 elements, I think, being spoken about. There's the feedback mechanisms that you've designed for the player. If you're trying to communicate a specific objective, telling them to do something, if they miss something, what feedback is there for them to go and revisit? Is it a journal? Is it a UI prompt? Whatever. It's the design of the feedback systems in the game to make sure the player knows what they're doing. Then it's the delivery mechanisms that you've got for your narrative delivery. It could be first-person VO. It could be notes found in the world. It could be audio diaries found throughout the world. There's different mechanisms, and at least from our experience, you need multiple of those to communicate certain things to the player. You need the critical path. Just this is the main. For the last 13 years now, we've been calling our critical path VO ribbon dialogue because of Ether 1 and you're collecting ribbons. So we've just, there's a legacy thing. We just call it ribbon dialogue. Like, what is the critical dialogue that you need? And then if it's just flavor dialogue, what other mechanisms have you got in your world? But I think the most critical point here, the third point, being like maybe over design of a game, in terms of, I have this idea that I want to communicate, and before the level or the environment is built and before players are playing, I know exactly what needs to happen, and then you try and shoehorn it in. And going back to what I said previously, we probably only design maybe, like, we know the core pillars of the game, we know the main beats, we block everything out in note cards, and we know what beats we want to hit throughout the game. But the moment to moment is very much reactive to the player. So if it's certain dialogue, we won't actually write actual lines until we can temp VO it in the playable space. We need to play the game and see what needs to be written here. We don't write a script and then try and put it into the level. We always think, okay, what is the player understanding? Do we need to insert a lane here? So we've never really ended up in a situation where things are kind of feeling a bit shoehorned. And I think historically we have done that. In Ether 1, we had to invent a system for these ribbon dialogues not to bump into each other and space them as far apart in the map as we could. But I think you just get used to the kind of layering process of temp dialogue, temp notes in the world, and just if you have these delivery mechanisms prototyped, then you just need to get them in as early as possible to be testing out those spaces and knowing what the player is understanding, what they're not understanding. And then if they're not understanding it, what feedback mechanisms do you use? Do you just try and be more specific in your script? Do you have a little journal, some UI prompts, those kind of things that you need to design in?
I couldn't agree more really on that kind of process. I think, Pete, it's very similar to our own kind of processes. We we have a lot of mechanisms in our game, objective systems that the player has agency over, for example. So we actually rely on a lot of those for guiding the kind of player and try to separate the systems a little bit. So for example, we have objectives that ping off dialogue, and then the player can recall those at any point. And we have like a diamond system in the game that kind of shows where they need to go to next. The player doesn't really have to think about it, and I think that's part of the problem, right? Is getting them not to have to worry about it. Did I miss something? Right? Okay, so and then they can kind of more comfortably just absorb story as they're kind of moving through that kind of space. On previous projects to Lunar Abyss, when I worked on Cube 2, we had a lot of. I mean, that's a very linear game, but the objectives or the context of what we wanted the player to do was all spoken through VO, right? So we didn't necessarily have an objective system, and very much what you were saying, James, things are missed. People go, oh, what am I meant to be doing again? Right, okay. So, and we'd hit problems like that all the time. Very simply, we'd have these open spaces where we have like 4 puzzle rooms to solve that to power a reactor to progress the game on, and people would just be like, I don't know what I'm meant to do, right? Okay.
Yeah,
I've
sat and watched those tests, man. I mean, like I always imagine myself as like, the Walter White meme in the car.
Yeah.
When the player runs past that thing you've set up, you're like,
exactly, yeah. So follow the wires. Follow the wires. The wires are that follow the wires. No, but nobody follows the wires, right? Okay. So
I didn't get it, and I'm like.
And so it's obviously kind of stressful. But there's a couple of things that we've done at Bonsai Collective to help with that. That's similar to what you were talking about, Pete. Is we try to separate basic game systems to guide the player from just dialogue to allow players to absorb that freely and more naturally where kind of possible. And obviously there's a massive iterative process about where do you put dialogue then, like where does it fit in the flow of your kind of world. You've built these great spaces, and our games punctuate. You've got traversal kind of platforming challenges and kind of combat challenges, and then just these spaces for story. So where do they kind of fit, and how do you plan that? And as an independent studio, a small team with lots of people kind of involved, in making small iterations all the time, we have to be very flexible and agile, to kind of find the right balance in those kind of spaces. So
yeah, that's what I was saying before, isn't it? It's so many small people doing so many different hats, right? So you have to be flexible, because you come back to it and you think, okay, this is in now, but actually that doesn't work. So let's change this, and it's like it creates a different dynamic, doesn't it? Really.
I think
you also only got.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say you've also only got so much time. So artist did something really cool, but it bloats the area, and it's like, well, we don't have time to go back and fix this. So
yeah, absolutely. And so getting that play testing in and getting that kind of player kind of feedback is really important. We did we for the first time in my career, we've done kind of deep UX testing on Lunar Abyss, where it's combat gamers. It's obviously critically kind of important to get that feedback, but we also got a lot of feedback on the story and what people were engaging with and what they were missing, and that player agency is really important, right? Okay, so and then we have to kind of tailor things to it. Maybe that's where a piece of lore is kind of placed, or maybe where that is a dialogue trigger, or maybe it's just where a music cue comes in. So it's it makes sense at that moment in time for the emotional feeling that we want the player to feel at that point. So
yeah, it's actually I could talk for hours about that. Maybe one time over a beer, next year's GDC, but I always find that fascinating. And what more the data that comes back, right? Because you have an idea thinking, my agency's good, I know how it's going to go. Then you get some data and you think, oof, okay, let's unpack this and get everybody on a call, usually on Zoom or Slack. But as it's LudoNarraCon panel, we'll wrap it up, I think, with more of a more narrative-focused question. And we'll just finish on, because I know where we are hitting time, but let's just talk about our inspiration for creating new worlds, right? And what we look to do in games. I know Pete spoke a little bit about that, so Xavier. How do we... is it important to be inspired? I know I've certainly spoke about this, when I did the idea and stuff. Some people said to me, why did you reference other games? Because people will associate those games with your time. And I said, well, that's crazy, because everybody's inspired, right? In some way, whether or not that's directly or indirectly or however you like. And it doesn't have to be another game. It could be someone in your life or a moment in life, perhaps, that inspired you. But I always think, is it important to seek out these inspirations, or do you prefer not to look as a technique and go, I'm going to solely go on our own experiences and try and create something, behind the curtain different, if you will, on our own? I mean, how do you guys approach that process before we go into the world building?
I mean, I see creativity pretty much universally as a process of synthesis. So I have friends who they say, I don't want to get influenced by anything out from the outside or maybe from these other people working in the same space right now. And that's a totally valid approach. But as far as Strange Scaffold is concerned, we end up in very weird places because we're pulling from life, from a bunch of different media sources. We're pulling from a bunch of different tonal places in the same game, even. Hence the anatomically correct heart and an airport failing is cleared by dogs. And now Sunshine Shuffle, we're looking at that being the first, like, that'll be the headline of the first major update for it. And yeah, I think it is important to, as a creator, I wonder if we would have less burnout in the video games industry if we had both the ability to continue to ingest material and to be inspired, and then to be able to build stuff off of that. Because it hurts to spend 5-6 years percolating on your magnum opus. And in all that time, no matter what inspires you, you have to shove it into a box to maybe work on when you're done.
Yeah, I'd really agree with that. I think for me, synthesis is, I think that's absolutely the right word. So yeah, so synthesis is about all experiences. I think it can be dangerous just to look at media. So just look at comparative media to what you're building, and you end up with a Frankenstein of a project. That can obviously happen. But we shouldn't discount that either. So we consume lots of things and we're inspired by different things. And I think that there should be a freedom to indulge in that, right? Okay, as a creative, and feed that into kind of your world building. So like real life I've had like a lot of real life philosophy. I speak to Pete about this quite a lot. So like philosophy, metaphysics, like lots of different kind of like life ideas, science, all of that real world influence and cultural influences, like feeding those into kind of our kind of projects is our kind of priority, I think, for me when world building. However, that doesn't mean that you can't look at your favorite game, right? Okay, so Silent Hill 2 is one of my favorite games. Some amazing work in there that I don't always think has like been repeated. So it's still an interesting case study to look at, right? Okay, so and be inspired by, and to wear your influences on your sleeve, I think is also quite brave sometimes. So so I think it's really important.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think there's a quite heavy dichotomy between kind of what Benny's alluding to in terms of you need to have tent poles to develop your game around. In terms of Silent Hill is this reference, X game. James, you were saying when you're talking to external partners, like it's like this meets this. Like you need to kind of give people something to latch onto for them to understand the media and for the team to understand the direction. And sometimes you do need these concrete examples. But then also on the flip side of that, I come from a heavy level design background, so I'm very much in the kind of world building, and I guess my hard skill now is more from a cinematography perspective. But I guess when I'm in those spaces trying to design levels or think of shots or whatever, I'm trying to block out the external sources, and it's just the things that I've lived I'm putting into the world and the spaces. So I'm not trying to explicitly take this piece of media and insert it in. But and so by that I mean that I don't really play video games outside of my day-to-day studio stuff. So I'll maybe play 1 or 2 video games a year. But yeah, just consume as much things externally to video games as I can, and that's not to even try and imply or find ways to insert it into my work. It's just when I'm level designing, I hit a flow state, or I'm setting up shots. Just these things that I've experienced outside of the game world are just being filtered through, whatever I'm creating. So it's kind of a push and pull between needing to give people very specific media references to say this is like this because it's a shared language and they know exactly what to expect. But then on the other side, when you're creating, I don't think it's as useful because, like Benny said, you're just going to end up with a Frankenstein if you're just taking your favorite bits from all these different things.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting debate to be had about the language we use, right? So when we speak to certain, for instance, when I talk to certain execs, there's a different language they're interested in, right? They're not interested in, like, say, Benny's mechanics and the length he goes to help the bits become fun for the player. They're looking at it as a product, right? So you talk in a different language to them, but you communicate the same information differently to your team, right? Because your team are the ones building the game. They're the ones that are really into the material because they need to be, right? It's relevant to what they're doing. So it's a case of, for me, I would say inspiration comes, and I actually think it's really interesting nowadays, because I don't know if you guys, but when like 10, 15 years ago when you play games, you'd never really associate the storytelling or that level with the same medium as movie, right? Or films or Oscars, etc. Now you're seeing The Last of Us translate to HBO. I'm sure we'll see more. I'm excited for the God of War show. But what I do mean by that is I think you can be inspired by a movie. Like, I'm big into Mike Flanagan. I don't know if you guys have seen Midnight Mass. Like, I'm big into stuff like that. And it doesn't necessarily translate to game, but it's in the same space in terms of the way you can create mediums of media, right? It doesn't have to be whether it's action-packed inputs, whether it's just, heavy rain style game, whatever, right? But I don't think it's ever been closer than it is today because the technology allows us to do that, right? So I do think if you're inspired in multitude of different ways, the tools allow you to do it, however you want to do that. If you want to go and create a Limbo or an Inside with no dialogue, amazing, yeah? With silent cinema, all that kind of stuff. But if you really want to create something deep immersive, you can do it in so many ways that isn't just making a cinematic game. You see what I mean? And I think that is a real strength of storytelling that we're heading into a very exciting time. So there you go. So awesome to chat with you guys. It's really nice to meet you all. Thank you for taking the time. Maybe we'll do another one. I don't know. I'm looking at Vincent. If we have another one planned, I will check my calendar. I promise you, Vincent, I will check my calendar. I promise. But really lovely. Thank you for hanging out. I know some of you guys have got a hard stop and you need to go. So thank you for sharing your insights. From just personally for me, it's very nice to meet you all. And I still don't know which camera's recording, so I'm going to wave at the screen and just say, hopefully that was okay. I tried to flow through the sheet, as coherent as possible. We didn't hit it all, but I thought that was an interesting, really, at least from my side, it really is interesting to listen to anyway, just to hear about different people's perspective.
Absolutely, yeah, really interesting. So really nice to meet you, James, and Zalavia. I know you, Pete. So yeah, I'm not going to speak to you anymore.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.